Hello and welcome. This is episode 3 of podcast about engineering management called Going Beyond Development. My name is Alex Maestrenko. I'm a podcaster and advisor to the CDTO in Kyiv City Council here in Ukraine. I have worked as engineering manager for the last 6 years in various companies. In this podcast, we are diving into the essence of engineering management. We will explore what engineering management is and what are their challenges and, opportunities within engineering management. For this journey, I will invite experienced engineering managers and leaders from all parts of the world. Today's guest is Pat Kua. Hello, Pat. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be on here.
Yeah, nice to have you here. So you're a keynote speaker, author, and a former CTO and chief scientist at N26, which is a huge German bank. And also a former technical consultant at ThoughtWorks, working with Martin Fowler, I guess, at that time. From your posts and your newsletter, I see that you're very into tech leadership, engineering management, and you're passionate about this. Is everything correct? Do you want to add anything?
That's correct. So probably the only thing I'd add is I've been independent for the last 3 years. With my own personal mission of helping people on their technical leadership journey, which includes engineering managers, just partly because I know a lot of people struggle as they make their transition into engineering management or technical leadership roles as well, and could do with some more support.
Nice. So today we want to talk about the transition from IC to their engineering management role, which is your core expertise, or which the thing that you're helping people right now. But before we dive into it, two things. First, dear listeners or dear viewers, please like and subscribe to the channel. More videos are coming from other engineering managers and more on this topic. And then their actual conversation before. What is engineering manager for you? Who is a person like engineering manager? What is your definition?
Yeah, so firstly, I want to sort of state it. I think you describe it well, which is it's my definition because we don't really have an industry-wide definition. But for me, it's a person who is basically accountable for the outcomes of a technical team. So it's a role, and they typically also do, in a majority of cases, people management. So typically they do some line or people management, but they're also accountable for the outcomes of one or more technical teams. And I use these terms specifically because some engineering managers don't necessarily need to be hands-on. That's often one of those challenges and struggles. And often a lot of engineering managers aren't necessarily the expert at whatever technology as well, but they are accountable for the outcomes. And so this means they need to understand the essence of mostly software development. Most technical teams are software. Obviously, there's places where it's maybe more hardware-based or maybe data sort of teams. But they need to understand the nature of software development. And so they need to understand, and they're responsible for managing the system, which is then the result of the outcomes, and therefore they're accountable. So that's my high level definition. And I will also describe this in that I have identified sort of 5 common archetypes of engineering managers.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And so that tends to be a little bit easier to describe each one of those archetypes more precisely, just because we don't have a shared industry definition.
Well, let's stop here for a second, because if you go to Wikipedia and they're typing in engineering management, you see that this term has been coined in 60s, I think, by an university in the US. And they say, their engineering management is a well-established procedure by now after, 40, 60 years, right? Since the term has been coined. Why don't we have that single definition in our industry?
So I think one reason is we're still a relatively young industry, and we have a lot of people who are continuously learning. So if I think about the sort of bar of getting into technology, university is one way a lot of people go to technology, but you have a lot of people that are self-taught. You have a lot of people that go through sort of coding boot camps, or they just start working, either independently, they take contracts, or working through an agency, and they get into the industry. And there's a whole body of knowledge that we don't sort of all share. So there's no sort of technical qualification for us to call ourselves, say, software engineers. And therefore, there's no sort of qualification or board controlling who becomes an engineering manager. So it's quite common that a lot of people get like thrown into their first role without a lot of that sort of history. And so I think people try to understand, okay, I have this title, and a lot of people struggle to understand what does that mean, even though we have, you know, a lot of resources and history around this.
So it's kind of a boiling pot right now where everything's changing so rapidly that it doesn't make sense to put a very strict definition, but rather the general guidelines for the role, kind of.
Yes and no. I mean, I think the industry changes fairly rapidly, but actually the problems of engineering management don't actually change very often. So I often like to share a couple of books. Well, I like to share a lot of different books, but you know, a couple of very common ones are things like Peopleware, so Tom DeMarco, Timothy Lister, Waltzing with Bears, Peopleware, and these books are kind of like classic books that tend to sort of last a very long time. And I think a lot of people don't read them. And, you know, if you think about what software looked like in, say, I think it was probably at least the 80s when it was written, or maybe 70s, it was very different. But actually, a lot of the problems they allude to are still the same. So concrete example, I think it was from the Peopleware book. But, you know, there's this example of, you know, why can't teams go faster? It's a common question engineering managers have to deal with.
Well, you put 9 people and it goes faster, right? There's a solution.
Right, throw more people at it. And then, you know, one of the stories that I think comes from that book is well, you know, here, I'll buy you 7 copies of the book. Of course, you can read the book a lot faster, right? And it's like, well, not quite, right? So there are some parts that don't really change, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, that's true. And there well, then I think also there are qualities that are required for their leaders and their engineering managers are also there and haven't changed a lot. What would be for you their top 3 qualities for somebody to be, well, a good engineering manager?
Great. Great question. It's hard to come down to just 3. But I like to say that I think good engineering managers are good leaders. So I've met some engineering managers that you might think are good managers, but they're also not necessarily great leaders. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you know, it's quite often that sometimes you have engineering managers that like to see their role as managing individuals and people. And I go back to, I think it's Grace Hopper who said, you know, you manage things like software or process, but you lead people. And so I think for me, a key part of good engineering managers is understanding how to lead people well. Today, that means a lot about sort of giving autonomy, about growing people. But, you know, I think a lot of people think engineering management is like micromanagement of people, which then leads to the perception of a bad engineering manager. So leadership, I think, or leading leadership skills is a key element of, I think, a good engineering manager. I think the second element is something about being sort of humble, is that I think sometimes there's pressure, particularly for fresh engineering managers who feel they have to know everything. And it's just impossible. As you alluded to, everything's changing so rapidly. A lot of engineering managers have that, like I'm not hands-on or I'm not as technical anymore. But that's not your role as an engineering manager. And I think part of that is knowing what you do know, knowing what you don't know, and being humble enough to sort of, or vulnerable enough to admit that to the team. And, you know, you have a whole team around you to accomplish the same sort of goals. You don't have to do everything by yourself. And I think that makes...
What do you say, kind of rely on the team to manage the project, their product that you are working together, so that you are kind of understanding and trusting the team to do something, even though things that you might not know or might not understand, right? It might be very, very technical and you don't have time to go into those details.
Absolutely. And a good engineering manager will lean on their team to sort of fill the gaps. But sometimes even a team doesn't have all the right knowledge. And so sometimes engineering managers also need to understand what the gap overall is. And maybe sometimes that means bringing in external help or support or knowledge to sort of fill gaps within the team. But there's that humility of recognizing, A, you can't do everything yourself. You have the people, your team around you, and there are other resources that organizations have. To answer your question and to close it off, the third element, I think, is what I describe as adaptability. And I think this really comes, I often talk about good engineering managers about sort of adding things to their toolkit. And in a particular situation, they know how to adapt their particular style. So as an example, if you're an engineering manager leading a very inexperienced team, like a whole bunch of people that have a year's worth of experience, you should be leading that team very differently than if you're managing a team of, just seniors, right? Like they're two very different dynamics, and good engineering managers know how to adapt to the situation.
Right. Though sometimes I would say if you gather a team, a group of very senior people, sometimes in the start you apply more or less the same techniques because they have their own egos as their senior people who want to kind of not work together but push their ideas and their creativity, and with all respect to people, right? People are different, and it might be even like they're senior people but fighting for the things you wouldn't expect to, right?
Absolutely. It's going to be a different dynamic than a bunch of young, maybe eager people, but don't have that experience and opinion.
True. Just taking off the stack, there are 5 archetypes that you mentioned. I'm curious to hear about them.
Sure. I normally forget 1 or 2, but I'll try to remember all of them.
We already managed up to 3 for the qualities. I think we'll manage to 5 for the
my stack is normally about 3, and then I forget. So getting older. So one of the first archetypes that I talk about is what is often described as the tech lead manager, or the tech lead engineering manager. And I would describe this archetype as being a person who's fairly hands-on still with whatever product that the team is building. So that archetype is typically still perhaps writing code, working on features, and they're really quite in the detail. They do have a very strong technical background or an experience because they're also sort of responsible for guiding technical or architecture decisions. So that's one archetype that's very common. A second archetype is typically where you have that technical expertise perhaps separated. And this is where you might have what I describe as the team lead engineering manager. Typically, a lot of these people don't necessarily need to be so technical, but what they do need to make sure is that there is somebody on the team that might be an explicit tech lead role. So a different role who is responsible for guiding technical decisions, teaching, coaching, making sure the team is growing their sort of technical quality, maintaining technical debt. But that role may not necessarily be responsible for, say, people management. And so they form a bit of a partnership where the team lead can really focus on growing people, providing care and attention to people, and also then working to make sure the team is actually working as a high-performing team. And often I describe it as dealing with organizational bureaucracy of like smoothing out all the organizational processes and things that companies generally need at some scale.
So between these two, if you put it on a scale, their technical knowledge and their organizational or leadership knowledge, they are basically kind of on the opposite sides, right? The first one has more technical knowledge and less organizational people leading, so to say. The second one is on the contrary. Would it be correct?
Yeah, so I don't like to describe it as capability or skill. I like to describe it as time and attention. So if I think about a good tech lead engineering manager, they should also still have a good understanding about how the organization works. But they probably don't spend a majority of their time dealing with that because they maybe need to be quite hands-on. Maybe it's a very complex system and they have to really be hands-on to manage that sort of risk. So I like to think of it as a time division rather than a skill or capability.
No, makes sense.
Where a tech lead will be spending a lot more time almost like an individual contributor, whereas a team lead engineering manager will probably spend a minimum amount of time because they can lean on somebody else to take care of some of the more technical aspects.
So what are the next ones? Are they somewhere in the middle or completely different?
Quite different, actually, I think.
Okay.
So I think one that I describe is the delivery engineering manager. And these types of people, I see them a lot in agencies or consultancies, where an agency or consulting company is brought in. They have a project to deliver, so it's a clear outcome by a certain time frame. And typically, a team isn't necessarily as long-lived as in a normal product organization, where that team is really there for the duration of that project. This is also true within a larger company where you assemble a project from maybe borrowing people from different teams. But from that sort of aspect, that person typically has very strong delivery management capabilities, so project management skills, very good communicators, very focused on schedule, very good at talking about dependencies and often managing dependencies across teams in an organization. From that side, they're less technical and maybe less about sort of organizational bureaucracy or people management, but they're really there to serve the purpose of getting a project completed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How would you make the difference between the delivery engineering management manager and the project manager? Because when you go from the classical or project management, or it's also more or less the same what you're saying for the delivery engineering management. And if you put engineering, it's already kind of very nicely sounding. But in my ears, what I hear, it's more or less the same as a project manager. Is there a difference, or just a proper scale, a different naming?
So in many places, it's another name for a project manager. But I do think one big difference of a delivery engineering manager archetype is that they're still accountable for the care and feeding of the team that they're working with. And so I think you can sometimes get project managers who literally are independent contractors who are really rewarded just for the delivery of the project. But what I see different with delivery engineering managers, there is still that sort of people team aspect where they're also responsible for the team and they care a lot more about the people than just the milestones being delivered.
Well, I could argue, but let's put it this way. In the sense, we have a lot, and they're quite big service organizations here in Ukraine. And when you're saying delivery manager, you're also putting their people management and people caring about people context. So that it's not only like milestone 1, 3, but also about their well-being of the people, and the projects can be long-lived in a sense for several years. Then you want to keep their team going for those several years, right? So it's not a kind of a few months and we are done, because those projects are, I'm not sure they even exist, right, for such quick projects. Because if it's like several years, you want to make sure that their atmosphere in the team, that the spirit of the team is great, and they are moving and working together for the time. But let's move on for the next one. I'm curious now.
So I just want to actually go back on that one, because I think that's true, which is that the engineering manager name is often given to delivery managers in some places, and so they are equivalents, but in other places they don't have a project manager. So I guess I'm just trying to describe, when I hear somebody who has an engineering manager name or title, sometimes it looks like a project manager, but there's the team scope that is still really key of that, and there are places who have project managers who aren't responsible. But the fourth archetype I describe as the product engineering manager. And the sort of two common situations where this role comes across, or this archetype comes across, is typically if you lose a product manager. So basically the engineering manager kind of needs to fill a gap of making sure the team is actually working on valuable things. And sometimes the right thing for that person to do is actually to say, okay, well, the teams may be self-sustaining. I'm going to go work with all the other stakeholders and fill the role of product management until perhaps you get somebody more permanent. So it's kind of a temporal thing that sometimes the engineering manager has to also don on the product management hat, and then responsible for planning, communications, stakeholder management, working with perhaps marketing or PR on product launches, so very product management type of skills. The second situation where this archetype typically comes across is where you have a more internal team. So this is typically maybe what people are starting to describe more as a platform team or a developer experience team or an infrastructure team, where there isn't really the end customer of the business. It's really the customers of the team are other teams within the organization. And so from that sort of perspective, it's often difficult to get good, say, product managers because they kind of need to understand a lot about that technical world. And so that kind of tends to fall on the engineering manager to, once again, work well with other teams.
What I'm thinking about is our technical product. I don't know, like GitLab or Grafana or, well, whatever technical product you can name. There could be also a permanent engineering product manager, right? Because they still need to understand their applications of their technical product and, care about the users, care about their growth of the product, so on and so forth. But those products are technical, so you have to have the technical background.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say that in good cases, companies recognize they need a good, strong product manager who understands that technical background. But in many cases where this archetype emerges is typically where people don't think they need product management. And so somebody needs to do that. And so that kind of falls onto the engineering manager because there's not that extra role or focus.
No. And okay, well, it's interesting so far, but what is the last one?
The last one I describe as a little bit different because it's at a different scope. So I describe it as the lead of leads engineering manager. And so this is typically the engineering manager, and sometimes they're just called an engineering manager. In other places, they might be called a senior engineering manager, but they typically have the accountability of multiple teams. And so that means that they are further away from whatever product. They can't necessarily write code or features, and they're typically leading other leaders. So they might have staff engineers reporting to them, tech leads reporting to them, each of them who are leading teams. And so it's sometimes what I would describe as a manager, but they're still called an engineering manager. Yeah,
so basically what you're doing with this classification, you're saying there are, 5 types, 4 types plus 1. In my head, I'm trying to summarize. 4 types plus 1 engineering manager, and when you're leading the team and you're being, with their engineering background and you're responsible for, partially for engineering question, then you're being engineering manager, and depending on the amount of time that you dedicate, it's either our technical side, it's either people side, it's either a project or it's a delivery. Then you basically say, there are these directions, and everyone who is in this position is an engineering manager, and there is a manager of managers, which is, kind of on top of this group, and they can have a combination of anyone in the group that reports to them.
That's correct. Very, very well summarized. And the difficulty we have is organizations sometimes just call these people or roles an engineering manager. And if you find yourself in that role, it can be very confusing as to what you should be doing. And I think what I wanted to describe was that it's okay if you do things a little bit differently from another person who has an engineering manager title, if that is what is needed in your circumstance.
But you have still to streamline somehow within the organization that you're working, so that you are kind of working along the same lines with your peers who are also engineering managers, I guess.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because in larger organizations, even if you have similar, say, titles, you can still get some of these archetypes emerge. So as a common example, let's say that you spin off a new team and that team has 3 people. In that sort of case, you definitely don't need a lead of leads engineering manager. And typically you don't even need a team lead engineering manager because a tech lead engineering manager can probably be relatively hands-on, take care of some of the people management. But that's quite different if that then team, say, grows tenfold or like at least triples over the next sort of year or two. One person won't typically be able to take care of all the activities for such a large team. And so you'll still get some variance within an organization, even if people have the same title.
True, because they will have different directions, they have different tasks and so on and so forth. So if we go to the first one, that's basically saying that you were working on the code, on the tasks, on the product, or doing great work. And then at one point in time, you either decided to step up, or you were promoted, or you were the best in the team, and you were promoted to be kind of a technical engineering manager. How does this happen in your experience, and what are the pitfalls when people are being promoted?
So firstly, I'd like to maybe change the word, and I'd like to encourage people not to think of it as a promotion. So I would like to rephrase it and reframe this is that they have been invited to play a different role. And the reason why I think it's quite important for that is a lot of the common struggles when people step into this different role is that often they're surprised by the activities they're now responsible or accountable for, and they often don't have a lot of the skill sets for that. So let's take an example. An engineering manager might need to be conducting or making sure that their team is getting regular feedback. Now, a lot of individual contributors could go their entire career without necessarily needing to refine a skill of giving and receiving effective feedback. And so that's something that is expected of you as an engineering manager, to make sure people getting good, timely feedback. And you have to know both what effective feedback looks like, but also, help your team deliver and share effective feedback. And you yourself will also need to give direct feedback. Sometimes some of this might be, feedback that it's helping people reinforce existing behavior. But sometimes and often it's about sort of helping people readjust behavior. And some people can find that difficult. And so that's why I describe it as a role shift, because a lot of people go in there thinking, I'm just going to be doing more of the same thing. And then most people are quite surprised. It's actually quite a different set of expectations. And then comes the whole question of, am I doing the right thing? Am I prepared for this? Do I like this thing? Oh, this is really different. Am I doing the right thing?
It's also their change of their activity. You've been working with people before, you talked to them, but you are talking rather technical on their kind of same level. And now you're shifting their level, the perspective. I'm not saying you're being the boss, but rather you have to understand that their communication with people becomes more important. And there you have to make sure you choose the right direction, the right words, and the right, frequency of communication to make sure that you are a leader and not just a peer within the group who is kind of tell me what to do, right? That's not what's going to happen.
Absolutely, and I think you said some words there that I really love, which is good engineering managers can choose how they communicate and react, and I think this is something that a lot of people aren't prepared for, so they've not practiced and they've really thought about how they're going to communicate or how they're going to interact. And a lot of first-time engineering managers kind of react from their gut, right? Because that's kind of how they did this as a team member. I'm I disagree with your approach. That's stupid, right? And people don't realize their words have these impacts that cascade a lot more. And people don't choose. And that's actually one of the skills I do work with a lot of early stage engineering managers on, which is emotional intelligence, about sort of recognizing, your state of emotion and to not let it interfere with the outcome that you're trying to reach, which often means being very deliberate about what you say and how you act.
For me, when I moved to the management role, what I realized that, first of all, you were kind of eat the last and you take their most uninteresting tasks. So you have to make sure that the team is working and it has all things resolved. And second, you are also kind of can achieve more with a team because you're not an individual contributor who has 24 hours in the day, but you have a team of, 5, 10, 100 people with whom you're working, whom you're leveraging to achieve a goal of the thing that you are creating. So kind of the leader becomes a multiplier, right? It basically says, have to move and have to create more things within the same time frame, right?
Absolutely. I think, I love the term multiplier. I often talk about that transition from maker to multiplier. And for a lot of people, there's this realization, or maybe lack of realization, that as a engineering manager, your actions and words multiply, both positively and negatively. And I think what you describe is a very common thing, which is some people see their job as to take on the most complex tasks, to do the most work, to tell people how to do things, not realizing they're actually multiplying sort of negative behaviors of people in the team become demotivated. It's I just get to take on the boring work. I'm not taking on anything challenging. I'm just getting told what to do. This is really not an environment I want to work in. And yet that person thinks that they're doing the right job, right? And so this is a challenging situation. And so a lot of engineering managers, first-time engineering managers, get surprised by all of these expectations, which is also something perhaps a reflection of their organization where they haven't had enough support moving into that role because it's not a promotion, it's a different role. And I think people need time to prepare for it.
Yeah, with a multiplier, with a developer, there is a story, there is a 10x developer kind of person who can deliver a lot of things. Are there 10x managers?
I think all managers are 10x. I think it's the question of what sort of thing are you multiplying, as you sort of mentioned. I think the interesting thing about management is a lot of people think that they need to manage individuals. And it goes back to that thing is that they should be managing things about the system and how people work and not necessarily managing individuals, which comes across as micromanagement. So I think it was Deming who said, a lot of the effectiveness of individuals is mostly determined by the system. And that's really what the engineering manager should be focusing on. So as an example, you could set up a system of building software, which has, everyone kept really busy, everyone working on the individual tasks. But that also means that you're going to maybe miss feedback loops. You're not necessarily going to build a collaborative environment. And there's a lot of sort of human potential that gets missed out on because of the work system that's sort of built in that sort of fashion. You might not actually reach your customer outcomes because people are being incentivized to complete perhaps, find as many bugs as possible if you're a tester or write as much code as you can as a developer, not even knowing if that actually makes its way into production, right? So there are different work systems. And I think this is where, the 10 times manager, a lot of the work goes into improving the system of work so that the people in that system can do their best work. And so that's why I'm a big believer in systems thinking, because I think that's the opportunity for people to be aware of how systems shape outcomes. And that's their opportunity to be a 10 times manager by improving the system rather than focusing on the individuals alone.
Yeah, I think you should reflect on their goal that you're trying to reach with the team, right? Might be it's basically the project you're working on is a customer project, and their customer wants to have a very strict timelines and a very strict reports. And what you're saying with the bugs and KPIs, makes sense. If it's value driven, when you have to build some value of the product, then it's a very different approach. So that's the thing that you already said, like build the right setup for each situation and for each team. As an additional thought here, the engineering manager, as everyone in our IT sphere, has to keep on learning and gathering more tools for the team that you can use now and in the future, right?
Absolutely. And I think the hard thing is, the emotional hard thing, I think, for engineering managers is, it's easy to sort of manage individuals. Like you have somebody in front of you, you see something and you think, oh, okay, well, I need that person to work longer or work faster, or, I put more pressure on them, or, they're failing to do something and they fail to recognize their own contribution in that. And I think that's the hard thing, which is like part of the outcome is also a reflection of how you have set up or allowed a system to continue running. And therefore, if you're not getting the outcomes that you're expecting, you're also partially sort of part of that system. And so that's hard for a lot of people to sort of recognize, is that it also requires that humility that I was talking about, the humbleness of saying, actually, I'm not perfect, but we all have an interest at making this better as well.
Yeah, true. And there's sometimes as a manager, you're kind of end your day with meetings and no outcomes. But then you start thinking, okay, what did I do today, right? I talked to one person, I resolved an issue here, I helped this one, I made a progress on some process, which is not there yet, but it's kind of going on. And then when you reach the point when your team says, well, Alex, we don't need you at this team meeting because everything works, and we know how to discuss the perfect outcome. So basically it's a good sign that you're moving in the right direction.
That's great. Absolutely.
We talked about the first archetype, and basically for me it sounds like I was again under IC, and then I got some additional tasks when I had to work with people, when I had to focus on people more. And the other archetypes are kind of changing drastically their proportion of the time you spend on the technical things and on their non-technical things. So for me, could sound like a career life choice, or well, I go to project management more, or well, to delivery management more, or product management more, and I kind of fade with the technical tasks. Is it correct understanding?
So yes, to a certain degree, you will lose, if you don't practice or if you're not sort of using tools, of course you will lose some current knowledge. But what I do like to emphasize is if you've had a good run at being an individual contributor, you've learned a lot of core principles that are also transferable. And so I think, what I like to think about these other archetypes is that you'll sort of add more tools to your toolkit. You'll add, being able to have more difficult conversations with people, mediating conflicts between team people, managing complex stakeholders, or actually getting to build, think about customers and think about like business value and outcomes, which you may not get to do. But a lot of these things, you don't lose some of those core skills of if you understand how to design software well, if you understand what good code looks like. Good code still looks like good code, regardless of what programming language you're talking about, right? So well-written methods, functions, sort of separation of concerns, things that are testable. When you think about design patterns, of thinking about things like ports and adapters, or hexagonal architecture, of keeping external dependencies on the outside, these things are sort of generic that, if you pick up a new thing, of course, you have to learn the syntax. But that's not typically the thing that holds teams back from complexity. And so, Charity Majors talks about the engineering management individual contributor pendulum of sort of moving from being an IC and an engineering manager. And if you do want to go back to being an IC, I think remembering that you should have some core principles that still apply. And then it really depends on what opportunities you have in your organization to be a little bit more hands-on, right? So you might then say, okay, I want to transition to managing a smaller team. So I'm moving from being a team lead and I want to get back to being more hands-on. So give me a smaller scoped project with less people. So I have more time to actually pick up some work and maybe start picking up some things again. In larger organizations, this is one of the benefits of some larger organizations. You can also do, a tour of duty of saying, actually, I want to do something for 6 months, literally become a team member and suspend, being an engineering manager for a while, just to re-scope up some sort of skills. It's a little bit hard if you're doing this across companies, because then you obviously lose a lot of that sort of social capital that you've built or the network. But it's definitely doable, and it's still doable.
Another thing that I got from Will Larson, and I think from Laura Tucker last time we spoke, is their application of technical skills to teams. For instance, Laura applicates check this, debugging of the team. So kind of as you debug your code, you can also debug the team and kind of go back from their team, why it's not working, what is missing. And Will Larson says also like user engineering principles that you are using in their designing system to design the team, right? They're the same approach to make it modular, to see the dependencies, to analyze each individual person and kind of build their roadmap as you're building for your software, the same for the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of engineering principles that do extrapolate. So just like with dependencies, managing external dependencies is a key thing to building software well. And that's also true with software, like managing teams of software. Those people are often people, so external decision makers or people who are shaping things, but still technical systems as well. And the more you have, the more risky it becomes as well. I also like to transpose the idea of, we often talk about code smells. So, we're looking at some code and we go, it's not like quite right. And, I kind of like to think about the same thing as like an engineering manager. You get like team or process smells. It's like, something's amiss. You're not quite sure what it is, but like there's something that's not quite right. And I think part of, being a good individual contributor or being a good manager is that taking that step back to sort of inspect, to recognize those smells, and also then to think, is there anything that's causing them, and can I do anything to control or influence that?
Yeah, so basically what we are talking, or you're saying that going from IC to EM is not a career choice, and you can always, if you want, move back. But who should try, and why should I just try go to the leadership and not progress on their technical scale, go to the staff engineer and or so on and so forth? Like what other motivators that I might have to go that way? I'm an engineer just sitting here and thinking, well, what should I do next, right? I have everything open in front of me. How do I decide?
Yes. It's a great question. I get this question a lot. And I like to encourage people to think that career growth doesn't mean up. There are many different ways to grow. Sometimes it means different skills. Sometimes it means working in different sort of verticals or industries. So I've met people who've literally just worked in finance or banking. And for them, working in retail is such a mind-blowing sort of experience just to sort of see how different that industry is. There's also sort of different skills that people can sort of build, be it sort of, facilitation, helping out with different things, or, working as part of maybe the CTO office or something like that, where you're doing something very different, or sort of startup or incubator type stuff where you're doing early stage type of product development or business development to a certain degree. So there's many different ways to grow, but I think when people think about my only way to grow is up, I think a lot of people think, well, it means more status and more money, and I think it's the wrong reasons to do any of those sorts of sort of high level roles. Like with everything, there are trade-offs, so nowhere is perfect. And I think a lot of people think, okay, the next level up, well, it's more money, more status, of course it's going to be a lot better. But of course, the trade-off there is you're also responsible for bigger outcomes. You have to deal with things like a lot more uncertainty. You have to work a lot more through influence in that you can't necessarily tell people, literally, if you're leading a 500-person organization, you can't literally tell every person what to do. And you'll have different levels of stress and things that some people have different tolerance for. And so some of those trade-offs are not necessarily things that everyone is ready for, wants to have. Is that I can tell you, having been an executive and worked closely with lots of CTOs, it's sometimes very difficult to have a very good work-life balance if you're the last person where everything gets escalated to. All right, so restructurings, layoffs, some of these things happen very quickly, and you're the go-to person to do that. And some people aren't ready to deal with those situations.
You mentioned moving to a different industry, and I'm smiling because I just moved to a different industry from financial sector to a government, which is completely different and there we were in services, and here I'm kind of on the government and basically on a kind of a product side, right? Ordering what do we want to do, how do we develop the city. That's really mind-blowing, and there work-life balance, indeed that's something you should not count on in the first several months when you switch the role in different between the industries.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing. Everyone, what's important to you or how you want to have impact is going to be different per person, and that will change over time, right? So sometimes some people, particularly early in their career, they want to just experience everything. They just want to do everything. But later, if you have a family and if you have kids and a mortgage, you might want some more stability. And for you, it might be more a predictable schedule that is more important to you at that time in your life than when you were maybe younger.
Is there anything important points about this transition that people should think about or accept what we already discussed?
So I think some of the things that we've discussed is really important, such as seeing it as a different role. And that means that if you're thinking about doing this role at a different point in your career later, you should start preparing now. So start thinking about skills that might come in useful. Because a lot of first-time engineering managers find themselves learning a lot of skills on the job, which is very stressful. If you've already built up some of those skills in advance, then you're going to have a much easier time slotting into that sort of engineering manager role. Lara Hogan talks about building your manager Voltron, so thinking about your support network, because one thing that's very common is that you're typically the only engineering manager on your team, and so it feels quite lonely compared to when you're an individual contributor and you could turn around and you could talk to somebody who's in pretty much the same sort of situation. You can't necessarily do that as an engineering manager. The other bit of advice is what I describe as sometimes sitting on your hands, which means being a little bit patient. Is that I think as individual contributors, you expect very fast feedback. Like you check some stuff in, you know if your build passes or it gets deployed. Sometimes as an engineering manager, the right thing to do is literally sit in your hands and sort of wait for some of the actions that you've done to take part, right? To have their impact. And so that's definitely something that's difficult for a lot of people to do when they find themselves in that role.
True, because basically their communication channel that we are talking now is one of the slowest in the world, right? Because we are using words, sounds, and there I'm saying something, you're hearing and you're interpreting this. You might interpret it in a different way. And there's the same for engineering managers. And here I would add, well, kind of get the feedback loop. Try to understand whether the person who you just talked to or heard or understood the same. Try to ask to write in different words, and there also try to establish a procedure or frequency in the sense that it doesn't have to be formal, but you have to repeat several times if you want to achieve something, not aggressively, right? Not to repeat like, okay, every day, well, guys, go fight, but rather try to understand that it doesn't happen, the change or the thing that you're implementing or putting a process that you are putting into action or the change in behavior doesn't happen overnight. As you told the person yesterday, okay, well, I did this and yes, okay, well, the feedback is so-and-so, please take into account the thing that you want to change or the process that you're established. It takes some time and some repetitions to make sure that the change happens and the team starts moving or the person starts moving in a different direction. I wouldn't say the direction you want, but I would say in a different direction.
Absolutely. The feedback loops are really important. And on what you were just talking about, best practice looks different being an IC versus an EM. So often as an IC, you're taught DRY principle, don't repeat yourself. And I like to encourage EMs to embrace the CRY principle, or continually repeat yourself for important matters. And it's okay to cry. It's perfectly fine. You're going to be dealing with a lot of emotion. Yes, and it's okay. Like you're human as well, but continually repeat yourself. It's a good practice as an engineering manager.
That's a good thing. All right. If you don't mind, I want to ask you something about your career, because I understand you were IC in the past, and then you moved to engineer manager, going to the executive office. Is there anything you're missing from your IC past?
That's an interesting question. Is there anything missing? I mean, there's a lot of experiences I could describe as I've never had. But I'm not necessarily feeling like I've missed out. So, for instance, I've never got my hands really deep into training machine learning algorithms or various things like this. I've often worked with data science teams, but not been, doing that myself. I was lucky because I worked in consulting, so I got to work on lots of different projects and industries. But I don't actually feel that there's anything that I feel like I was missing as a individual contributor. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun. I'm sure I wrote some terrible code along the way. I'm sorry for anyone who has to maintain them. We were all learning at the same sort of time. But also, it was also exciting to see impact of the software that I was able to build and contribute to. So I don't really feel like I am actually missing anything as a individual contributor from my career.
And what was your motivation to go to EM from their individual contributor?
So for me, I think having impact has personally been very important, right? So it's one of the reasons I moved to wanting to work environments with agile software development early in my career, when everyone else was doing waterfall, is I wanted to see people using the thing that I built. Is that earlier in my career, I worked on large projects that I'm pretty sure never really got released to end users. And there's some satisfaction of sort of seeing the thing that you built or contributed to have an impact. And for me, I realized that, when I was starting to lead teams, I could also help other people lead their teams better. And part of this is a little bit of paying it forward of not having systems or support or knowledge about what it meant to be a good tech lead or engineering manager. And so I want to have that impact. And the feedback loop is a lot longer, I can tell you. It's like several years sometimes. But sometimes it's nice to get that, email out of the blue saying, hey, like I was like maybe on one of your courses or I saw a talk and like, it really helped me along my path. And for me, I get to have that impact in a different perspective across different media like this a podcast or YouTube channel and the courses that I run. And for me, that's very fulfilling of like helping people grow. We have more people stepping into these roles every day, often literally thrown in without any support. And so, if I can do my part to help them get better, then it helps their team get better. And their organization gets better, and hopefully everyone wins in that process.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you, Pat, for this conversation. If people want to find more about your experience or follow you, or where can they find you?
You can find me on my website, patkua.com, or the same handle on Twitter. And please do reach out if you have any questions.
I know that you are also giving courses, or who can be interested in those courses?
In-person and virtual workshops. So you can go to them on my website. There's one which is about technical leadership. So for people who are more in the tech lead, not necessarily people management space, that's called Shortcut to Tech Leadership. And then I also run a course called Engineering Manager Essentials, which goes into a lot of skills and tools for first-time or early-stage engineering managers. And then I also have some deep dive sort of skills-focused course at the techlead.academy. And these are really about focused on one particular skill, such as communication, like communicate like a CTO, about helping people master a particular skill, regardless of whatever role you might be playing as a technical leader.
Yeah, I enjoy following your Twitter because you're bringing all the time new articles on their new information, sometimes from the past, sometimes they're quite actual, but as we mentioned there in our conversation, their approaches and some things are not changing for their quite some time. So, it makes sense to reread their article published in 2015, 2016, and kind of see, it's still applicable, and I still haven't tried it. Oh my God, I have to go and think if it's applicable for me, and if I can get this additional thing going on. All right, Pat, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for your time in this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.